I'll never forget my first trip to a Hindu temple. I was in India on a mission trip, so I couldn't miss the opportunity. And besides, how bad could it be? I serve the living God, and he's a lot more powerful than those little figurines. But what happened to me when I walked through the door was completely not what I expected. The feeling of spiritual oppression absolutely overwhelmed me. So 45 seconds after entering the shrine, with heart pounding and chest heaving, I ran out. I just couldn't take it. And I can suspect that this is what Paul was going through when he went through Athens. But like Paul, I was called to reach this culture. So I needed to figure out some way of reaching the people who were worshiping there. So I decided to take a page out of his book and try his methods for reaching another culture. Now I know what you're thinking. Good for you, Jody. You went to India and battled those foreign idols. But I live in America. I don't have to deal with that kind of thing here. We're past that. Oh, really? Just because they're not bright blue or 14 feet tall or have 17 heads doesn't mean that we don't deal with idolatry here in the United States. Take, for instance, Tom. He has a wife and 2 young children at home, but spends 14 hours a day, every day at the office because he has to be seen by his coworkers as the best at his job. And then there's Ashley, who at 17 has turned to bulimia because the modeling agencies tell her that 5'11" and 140 pounds is just too big. And then there's Eric, whose wife and 2-year-old son just left because he can't tear himself away from internet pornography. See, idolatry isn't about a statue. It's about a frame of mind that makes anything more important than God and the life that he offers. So if we're going to bring the light of Christ to these people, we have to figure out a way to do it so that we'll be heard and understood. Paul did just that in Athens. So let's take a look at Acts 17, verses 16 through 34, and see what he did. Now, I know that y'all have been through Acts 17 before, and I know that y'all have been through gospel presentations before. So rather than look at what he said, we're going to look at how he said it. And we'll see that Paul was able to connect with his Athenian hearers because he made a concerted effort to meet them where they were. He did this in 4 ways. The first of which was that Paul understood the culture. Because he had jumped in and got first-hand experience of these people, he knew how their minds worked. Now, part of this was because of the way that he was brought up. He was raised in Tarsus, which was known throughout the Roman Empire for its scholastic excellence. In fact, it ranked right up there with Athens. So because he was schooled in such a way, he knew the ins and outs of Greek philosophy. Now, that means, in addition to being able to speak with the Jews in the synagogue, he was also able to go out into the marketplace and talk with the Greeks who were out there. And because he knew how they lived, he was able to, he made a concerted effort to go out and meet them where they lived. He didn't wait for them to come to him because he knew if he did, he'd be waiting forever. So, because he interacted with them on their home turf, he knew that they were always on the lookout for something new. And so he boldly presented them with that opportunity. And you can tell that he piqued their interest because of their response. They invited him to come up to the Areopagus, where all of the big-wig philosophers hung out, so he could discuss his ideas even further. Now, let's look at ourselves. Let's step back. Paul was willing to assert himself into the Athenian home context. Are we willing to do the same thing? Are we willing to take the time and effort to understand our neighbors, their minds, and their intellects? Do we want to know their hopes, their fears, their dreams, and all of their other little peculiarities? Or is it easier just to rest on our assumptions? All right, back to Paul. he laid a great foundation by understanding where they were coming from. He built on this strategy with his next strategy. Paul did not judge them. Even though he knew their culture and the flaws within it, he didn't stand in judgment over them. We can see Luke describing this a little bit further through a few key terms that he uses. The first is katedolon. Now, this is when Paul is walking through Athens and he's accosted by all of the idols. Now, most Bibles usually translate this as full of idols. But what we see actually is this image that they're putting forth of a forest of idols. The city's literally crowded out with them. And this would have put Paul on spiritual overload. We can tell because of the next term, parzuneto. Most translations, again, just kind of say that his spirit was provoked within him or he was sorely distressed. But it really doesn't do the term justice, because what we find is that he was having a physical reaction. He was violently ill because of all of this idolatry. I can only imagine that my experience in the Hindu temple was close to what he was experiencing. But even though he had this really bad reaction to what was going on, he still chose to treat his counterparts with respect and honor, even when they didn't offer him the same privilege. We can see this in the next term, spermologos. As Paul was going through the marketplace in Athens, he kind of picked up a nickname. It literally means seed picker. And it draws to mind the image of a bird who's flying around picking up seeds wherever you can find them. Basically, these Athenians were insinuating that Paul was picking up this philosophy from wherever he could find it and passing it off as his own. Now, even today, it's easy to see how much of an insult that can be. But Paul counters it when he goes up to the Areopagus with the term, let's see if we can get this right, desidemonesterus. I've been practicing that for like 2 weeks now. Basically, Paul is using a really big term to tell them that they're being devoutly religious. Now, rather than just slashing on them for what he knows that they're doing wrong, namely idol worship, he's choosing to hail them for what they're doing right. They're devoting their lives to a higher power. So, what we see here is that not only is Paul warming up his audience, but he's also giving himself a great starting spot for the rest of his sermon. So, like Paul, we are called into a culture that seems to put everything in front of God. What's our reaction to that? Are we affected by what we see? Or do we grow numb to the fact that people seem to put God's reputation down at every turn? At the same time, how are we responding to this? Do we commit to being respectful of those who disagree with us? Or do we let our principles get in the way?